Welcome to Deloitte's Debrief Test webcast series in Asia Pacific. Our webcast today is from our Geography Update series and is titled Hong Kong SAR Budget 2023 and 24 Commentary. My name is Polly Wan and I am a tax partner based in Deloitte, China. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webcast. I have two speakers today with me. They are Roy Fang and Jackie Wong. They are both based in Deloitte, China. You may access our bios on the left side of the screen. Before I introduce the agenda for today's webcast, I would like to take a moment to highlight some of the features of our webcast console, just in case you are new to us. First of all users are on listen-only mode. If you have any content-related questions, you can submit it at any time in the Q&A box at the bottom right of the screen. We will do our best to respond to your questions during the presentation. Second, all PC users can maximize or minimize each box at your convenience during the webcast. You may also explore the icons at the bottom of the screen. If you want to download today's slides and related publications, please go to the Downloads and Links box. On the other hand, mobile device users can view the slides and answer the survey on screen. Thirdly, if you require an attendance record for this event, you will receive an automated email with CPE certificate after watching for 15 minutes. Next slide, please. Today's webcast is about the budget of Hong Kong SAR announced by our Financial Secretary in the last month. In the following hour, we shall give you a highlight of this budget, and then the measure proposed to attract talents and enterprise to Hong Kong, and the measures to uphold Hong Kong's position as an international financial and asset management center. Lastly, we'll talk about the tax incentive for specific industry sectors timeline in Hong Kong. We shall have a Q&A section at the end. Now let's start our sharing today. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. Hong Kong adopts a financial year end of March 31st. For the fiscal year ending March 23, it is estimated that Hong Kong would suffer from an operating deficit of 196 billion Hong Kong dollar. The consolidated deficit after bond repayment is estimated to be close to 140 billion Hong Kong dollar, which is the second largest deficit in Hong Kong after 2020, when Hong Kong was first hit by COVID. Unlike many other jurisdictions, Hong Kong was just resumed from the quarantine-free travel with China and the rest of the world at the end of year 22. During most of the time in this fiscal year, Hong Kong was under various COVID restrictions, which seriously affected the business activities. But according to the statistic, the impact of decrease in revenue from profits tax and salaries tax was relatively small. The rather huge deficit in this year was mainly caused by the increase in expenditure on healthcare sector, as well as the fall in revenue from land sales and stamp duty. Land sales is one of the major revenue sources in Hong Kong. It is interesting to know that despite COVID started in 2020, the land sales in Hong Kong was actually quite good in the last fiscal year. In particular, there was 2 record high land sales transactions in Hong Kong in 21. Comparatively, the land sales in Hong Kong in this year was much less than that of the previous years. For the estimated results for the coming 5 years, our Financial Secretary took a moderately liberal stance in preparing the budget for the coming years. As the Hong Kong economy is at the early stage of recovery, the government considered that it is important to gear up for speedy recovery and resume to normal. A series of campaigns will be launched to attract tourists and businessmen to come to Hong Kong. For instance, various international events will be held here. Certain free tickets and gift packs will be given out to inbound visitors, etc. Hopefully, bring Hong Kong back to one of the most welcome places for visit. More importantly, various measures are introduced to attract enterprise and investment to Hong Kong to boost the momentum of our economic revival. Also, quite many budget initiatives were introduced to benefit the general public and the small and medium enterprise in this post-COVID recovery time. Based on the forecast, Hong Kong will continue to have a deficit budget for the next fiscal year 24. It is expected that with the continuous effort of the government, Hong Kong will visibly recover and resume to a break-even and surplus position in the year after. We shall talk about these measures later. In terms of the financing and level of fiscal reserve, Hong Kong plans to continue to issue government bonds in the coming years. The Financial Secretary emphasized that Hong Kong will adhere to the fiscal discipline of keeping expenditure within the limits of revenue, and the proceeds from bond issuance will not be used for funding recurring expenditure. The fiscal reserve in Hong Kong will remain maintained at 12 months or above of the monthly expenditure of the Hong Kong government. Indeed, the government bonds mainly refer to the green bond, and green bond is not new in Hong Kong. In January this year, the Hong Kong government issued $5.75 billion equivalent of green bond denominated in US dollar, euro, and RMB. This triple currency offering is the largest ESG bond issuance in Asia. In February this year, the Hong Kong government also issued 8 million Hong Kong dollar tokenized green bond, which is the first of this kind issued by government globally. It demonstrates Hong Kong government's determination to become a premium center for green and sustainable finance. Next page, please. Next page, please. For GDP, Hong Kong GDP recorded a negative growth in the year 22. It was mainly resulting from the COVID restrictions, which seriously affected business activities. GDP growth is forecast to range from 3.5% to 5.5% in real terms in the year 23. From year 24 to 27, the trend growth rate of the economy in real terms is assumed to be 3.7% per annum. And the GDP deflator, which measures the overall price change in the economy, is forecast to increase by 3% in the year 23 and 2.7% from year 24 to 27. Next slide, please. This year's budget continues to provide various relief measures to the general public and corporates. For individuals, there is a 100% salaries tax deduction, capped at 6,000 Hong Kong dollar, and the most welcome consumption vouchers. Eligible person would receive 5,000 Hong Kong dollar in this year. The consumption vouchers are not only provided to Hong Kong permanent residents, but also to new arrivals. It means people who have come to Hong Kong for living or study through various channels are also eligible to the vouchers, though the amount would be in half. The government also proposed changes to child allowance and adjust the value band of ad valorem stamp duty for transfer of properties in Hong Kong. This change reduced the stamp duty for first-time property buyer for property value below 10 million Hong Kong dollar. For properties worth less than 3 million Hong Kong dollar, the stamp duty would only be 100 Hong Kong dollar. Just to give you a little more background, transfer of Hong Kong properties and Hong Kong shares are subject to stamp duty in Hong Kong. At present, there are special measures for transfer of residential properties, which a relatively high stamp duty will be imposed in certain situations. It is commonly known as the harsh measures. It is to prevent the speculation of Hong Kong properties and overheating of the Hong Kong property market. In essence, only Hong Kong resident who is the first-time property buyer or does not own any other property will be entitled to a lower stamp duty rate. These harsh measures were introduced by the Hong Kong government years ago. Before the announcement of the budget, there are quite many noises in the market to urge the government to abolish these harsh measures. The adjustment of value band of stamp duty rate in the budget helps to respond to the ask of public and at the same time prevent the overheating of the property market in Hong Kong. On corporate side, there is also a 100% profits tax reduction capped at 6,000 Hong Kong dollar. There are miscellaneous concessions, such as concession for government rates for non-domestic properties, rental or fee concession for government premises and short-term tenancies, etc. There is also an increase in tax deduction for mandatory provident fund voluntary contributions made by employers for the employees aged 65 or above. And there is an extension of the application period for the special 100% loan guarantee under the SME financing guarantee scheme. The special 100% loan guarantee refers to a scheme which Hong Kong government provide full guarantee to loan applicant at a concessionary low interest rate. The maximum loan amount is the total amount of wages and rent for 27 months or 9 million Hong Kong dollar, whichever is lower. The maximum repayment period is 10 years. This scheme aimed at alleviating the financial burden of companies in paying wages and rents, which will suffer from the reduced income from COVID, which hopefully help to minimize the companies from shutting down and lay off. Next slide, please. The government recognized that quite many talents and companies left Hong Kong during COVID. So now, the top priority of Hong Kong government is to attract talents and investments back to Hong Kong. Actually, soon after the policy address announced by our chief executive in late year 22, the government has proposed a series of initiatives to attract overseas talents and nurture local talents. Various committees were set up by the government for attracting strategic and high-potential enterprise from all over the world to Hong Kong. There are new measures in the budget to further attract the talents and enterprise. On talent side, a new round of capital investment entrance scheme will be introduced to enrich the city's talent pool and attract more new capital to Hong Kong. Under this scheme, the applicants shall make investment at a certain amount in the local asset market, excluding the properties. Upon approval, they may reside in or pursue development in Hong Kong. Details of the scheme will be announced later. In addition, the Hong Kong government also introduced a new Top Talent Pass scheme at the end of year 22 to attract overseas talents. Under this new scheme, qualified applicants can be granted an initial stay in Hong Kong for 24 months even without any Hong Kong employment offer. The Hong Kong government received many applications under this new Top Talent Pass scheme since the introduction. We have a publication on this Top Talent Pass scheme. If you are interested, you can download it for more details. On the investment side, there are various key measures to attract investment. They are not really tax deduction, but some changes to Hong Kong a more attractive place for investment. Firstly, to facilitate foreign companies to redomicile to Hong Kong. Hong Kong has long been a hub for multinational enterprise and as a headquarters for many MNCs. Hong Kong has an extensive and expanding treaty network. We have well-developed legal system and professional service. Our tax system is relatively simple, income tax rate fairly low, and no VAT GST. Many foreign companies redomicile their headquarters to Hong Kong in the recent years, especially when the tax position of large MNCs become more transparent after the BEPS initiative. Under current practice, the foreign company needs to register in Hong Kong and then apply for the Hong Kong Tax Residence Certificate from the Hong Kong Inner Revenue Department when it is required to obtain the certificate to apply for the treaty benefit. We call it certificate a COR. To obtain a COR, this company needs to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the IRD that the central management and control of this company is exercised in Hong Kong. If the IRD is satisfied that the central management and control of this foreign company is actually exercised in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong IRD would grant a certificate to this company. we have helped quite many overseas companies to obtain a COR in Hong Kong. In the budget, it is proposed that a mechanism will be introduced to facilitate companies domiciled overseas to redomicile to Hong Kong, particularly for enterprise with a business focus in the Asia-Pacific region. In fact, it is one of the suggestions proposed by our Deloitte budget team to the Financial Secretary. The Hong Kong government will conduct consultation and submit for legislative approval proposals in the coming year. Secondly, provide tax certainty on capital gain on equity interest. Under current regulations, capital gain is not taxable in Hong Kong. To determine whether a gain is capital nature, the Hong Kong Inland Revenue Department will look at the facts and circumstances. For instance, the intention of acquiring the asset, the reasons for disposal, the length of ownership, frequency of similar transactions, and so on. In other words, the length of ownership is not the only factor that the RRD would consider. On the bright side, a company could argue that a disposal gain is capital nature, even though it was disposed of shortly after acquisition. However, it creates tax uncertainty for companies which actually held the asset for a fairly long time, say a few years, especially for those generate huge gain on disposals. In the budget, the Financial Secretary said we would launch a consultation to enhance the tax uncertainty on onshore gains on disposal of equity interests. We anticipate that a clear guideline will be provided by the RRD. Let's keep in view of this change. You may wonder why we just mentioned onshore gains on disposal of equity interests. Is it simply because Hong Kong adopts a territorial basis of taxation? Partly correct. It is true that Hong Kong adopts territorial basis of taxation, which means offshore profits are not taxable in Hong Kong. However, there is a new tax regime in Hong Kong starting from this year. Starting from January 23, Hong Kong companies which receive certain foreign source income in Hong Kong would be deemed source in Hong Kong. If this Hong Kong company cannot satisfy the economic substance requirement or other conditions, this offshore income would be deemed source in Hong Kong and taxable here. The four types of foreign source income covered in this new regime include dividend, disposal gain, interest, and IP income. It is the so-called Foreign Source Income Exemption Regime, FSIE. Under the new FSIE regime, if a Hong Kong company derives offshore gain on disposal of investment, the gain may be taxable in Hong Kong if the Hong Kong company cannot satisfy the economic substance requirement. In the past, we could try to argue that this offshore disposal gain is capital in nature. But under the new FSIE regime, even though the gain is of capital nature, the Hong Kong company still needs to satisfy the economic substance requirement in order to enjoy exemption of this offshore disposal gain. We would like to emphasize that the territorial basis of taxation in Hong Kong remain unchanged. In fact, the introduction of FSIE in Hong Kong is in response to the EU's inclusion of Hong Kong in its grey list in October 21. The Hong Kong tax system remains competitive after this regime. We had conducted a webcast on this topic, FSIE, before. If you would like to learn more about the details, you may check it out at our debrief library or download our text analysis. Please note that the webcast and text analysis are for your reference only, as there will be some changes in this year. Now, let me pass the time to Roy.
Thanks, Polly. As we all know that Hong Kong is an international financial and asset management center. In recent years, the Hong Kong government has rolled out a number of incentives, both from tax and non-tax perspective, to strengthen Hong Kong's competitive advantage, especially in the asset management space. For instance, since 1st April 2019, Hong Kong has a tax exemption regime for funds, which referred to as a Unified Fund Exemption Regime, UFE. It provides Hong Kong profits tax exemption for private funds with different strategies, including PE/VC funds and hedge funds, that are managed by fund managers in Hong Kong. The tax concession regime for carry interest was also enacted in 2021, which applies retrospectively to eligible carry interest accrued or received on or after 1st April 2020. These measures provide an incentive for fund managers to set up and manage their funds in Hong Kong. Besides, Hong Kong also has the Limited Partnership Fund (LPF) regime, effective from 31st August 2020, which provide legal framework for PE/VC fund, in particular, to be set up in Hong Kong in the form of limited partnership. Besides, the Hong Kong government has also launched a subsidy program to refund up to Hong Kong dollar 1 million on the professional fee incurred by each open-ended fund company (OFC) established or redomiciled to Hong Kong. We have seen more and more private funds set up in the form of LPF or OFC in Hong Kong as the fund vehicles. In the last year or so, we have seen the Hong Kong SAR government turning their focus more on promoting Hong Kong's family office business, which is a fast-growing sector in the asset management space. In this year's budget, the Financial Secretary promised that Hong Kong dollar 100 million will be allocated to Invest Hong Kong over the next 3 years for attracting more family offices to Hong Kong. And there will be a tax concession regime for single family office, which I will elaborate further in the next 10 minutes or so. The government has set a target of attracting at least 200 family offices to set up in Hong Kong by the end of 2025. Besides, the budget also mentioned that a review will be carried out on the existing fund exemption and carry interest tax exemption regimes in Hong Kong. And we hope that enhancement will be made to both with even more attractive and user-friendly. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at where we are in terms of the new Hong Kong tax concession regime for single family office. In March 2022, the Hong Kong government issued a conceptual paper regarding this new regime and invited feedback and comments from the industry. After industry consultations, the Hong Kong government published the draft bill in December 2022 and introduced the draft bill to the Legislative Council for review and reading. The Legislative Council has formed a Bills Committee to discuss the draft bill. As confirmed by the Financial Secretary in the budget speech, upon passage of the draft bill, which we expect will happen soon, the tax concession regime will be applicable to any year of assessment on or after 1st April 2022. In the coming part, I will spend some time to go through the key features of this new tax concession regime for single family office. Next slide, please. As a backdrop, a typical single family office structure contains investment holding vehicle, which we refer to as FIHV on the left-hand side, to hold assets for the family, and a separate entity as the single family office, which holds the people, the asset, the investment team to manage the assets held by the FIHVs. Investment gains usually arise at the FIHV level, which would have potential Hong Kong tax exposure if such investment gains were derived from a trade or business carried on through the single family office in Hong Kong, and if such gains were Hong Kong sourced. It is worth noting that the existing Hong Kong tax exemption for private funds, which is the UFE that I mentioned earlier, would generally not be applicable to the FIHV owned by a single family, as this FIHV cannot meet the definition of fund under the Unified Fund Exemption regime. Therefore, in order to attract more single family office to set up and manage the family's investments in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong government is launching the new Hong Kong tax concession regime for single family office, which offer Hong Kong profits tax exemption to the FIHV managed by single family office established and has adequate substance in Hong Kong, provided other requirements under the new regime can be satisfied. Besides, special purpose entities (SPE) or SPV established by the eligible FIHV would also be eligible for tax exemption, which provides such structuring flexibility for FIHV to make investment via SPE or SPV. Let's go through the key requirement of the new regime in our next slide. Next slide, please. Firstly, the FIHV on the left-hand side can be in different legal form, including a corporation, partnership, or trust, and they can be established or created in or outside Hong Kong. So it provides flexibility to the choice of vehicle and governing law of the FIHV. The central management and control of the FIHV is required to be exercised in Hong Kong. This may involve FIHV appointing Hong Kong-based director or delegating its central management and control function to the single family office entity on the right-hand side. Besides, the FIHV should only serve as an investment holding vehicle for holding and administering the assets on behalf of the family, and it should not carry out other trade or business in Hong Kong. There is also a minimum assets under management AUM threshold of 240 million Hong Kong dollar, which means the aggregate value of specified assets managed by the single family office for up to 50 FIHV of the relevant family must be at least 240 million Hong Kong dollar. We will cover the definition of specified assets later, but it is worth noting that it does not include Hong Kong real property or real estate. Another important aspect is that the FIHV are required to carry out their core income-generating activities in Hong Kong by meeting the so-called substantial activities requirements under the new regime. As proposed in the new regime, the FIHV should have at least 2 qualified full-time employees in Hong Kong and an annual operating expenses incurred in Hong Kong of at least 2 million Hong Kong dollar. While it is more common that the FIHV, as purely an investment holding vehicle, does not have any employee and would outsource the investment management activities to the single family office entity on the right-hand side, the substance of the single family office entity on the right-hand side could be taken into account when considering whether the FIHV could meet the substantial activity requirements. Now, regarding the single family office entity on the right-hand side, it should be a private company incorporated in Hong Kong or outside Hong Kong, and with central management and control exercised in Hong Kong. So similarly, the single family office entity may need to appoint a Hong Kong-based director to ensure that the central management and controls are exercised in Hong Kong. The beneficial interests of both the FIHV and the single family office entity should be at least 95% directly or indirectly held by one or more members of a single family. Besides, the service fee income derived by the single family office entity from provisions of investment management services to the FIHV should be chargeable to tax in Hong Kong, while the charging basis will be subject to the transfer pricing rules in Hong Kong. Unlike FIHV, it is okay for single family office entity to perform activities other than providing services to the FIHV. For example, the single family office can also make investment in its own name and may manage assets for external investor, which of course is subject to regulatory licensing requirement in Hong Kong, as long as the 75% safe harbor rule is met. In other words, at least 75% of the accessible profits of the single family office entity should be arising from the provision of services to FIHV, the SPE owned by FIHV, or a member of the family. Meeting the above mentioned conditions, the FIHV and its SPE could be exempt from Hong Kong profits tax in respect of accessible profits derived from qualifying transaction, which basically mirror the definitions under the Unified Fund Exemption regime. Qualifying transactions include transactions in specified assets as defined under Schedule 16C of the Inland Revenue Ordinance, and incidental transactions subject to a 5% threshold. Next slide, please. These slides include definitions of specified assets under Schedule 16C, which basically include investment in listed securities, private equity, futures, foreign exchange contract, certificates of deposit, exchange traded commodities, OTC derivative, etc. So it's a pretty wide range of assets that the family office can invest into with the tax exemption applicable. But it is worth noting that the specified asset definition currently do not include real estate, digital assets such as cryptocurrencies, etc. Next page. For investment in PE, in private equity or private companies, there are additional tasks to be fulfilled in order to get the tax exemption under the new regime. First is the immovable property tax, which is looking at whether the investee company has 10% or more asset in Hong Kong immovable property. If yes, there will be no tax exemption for FIHV or SPE investing into this investee company. After the immovable property tax, then we look at the holding period test to see whether the FIHV or SPE has held the equity or debt interest in the investee company for at least 2 years. If holding period is 2 years or more, then there will be tax exemption on gains derived by the FIHV or SPE from the exits of the investment. But if the holding period is less than 2 years, tax exemption will still apply if FIHV or SPE does not have controlling interest in the investee company. If the holding period is less than 2 years and there is controlling interest, then we need to further look at the short-term asset tax to determine whether the tax exemption would apply. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates the definition of family for the purpose of the new concession regime. I'm not going to go into detail, but broadly, the definition includes spouse, which includes deceased spouse, parents, grandparents, child, include adopted and stepchild, grandchild, sibling, which includes spouse, sibling, and their spouse and their child, etc. So it's a pretty broad definition of family. Next slide, please. It is also worth noting that the new tax exemption regimes for single family office only apply to FIHV owned by member within the same family. Because the requirement is that both the FIHV and the single family office entity need to be 95% held by one or more member of one single family. So the new regime does not apply to multi-family office structure on the right-hand side. However, as a multi-family office structure is essentially a fund structure, whereby a fund manager, which is likely a SFC licensed investment manager in Hong Kong, will manage a fund vehicle which pool the capital injected by different families. So it is probable that the fund vehicle can be exempt from Hong Kong profits tax under the Unified Fund Exemption regime in Hong Kong. However, please note that there is a deeming provision, or what we call the anti-avoidance provision under the Unified Fund Exemption regime, which may trigger a deemed tax at the investor level if it is a Hong Kong person which holds 30% or more interest in a tax-exempt fund vehicle. So imagine on the structure here, say for instance, family X is a Hong Kong family which hold maybe say 40% interest in the fund vehicle. Then the deeming provision may kick in, whereby the fund vehicle could still be exempt from Hong Kong profits tax under the Unified Fund Exemption regime, but the otherwise taxable profits of the fund vehicle would be allocated to family X, based on the percentage of holding, which is 40%, and that will be treated as a deemed profit at family X level and would be subject to tax at family X level. So this is a major difference between the Unified Fund Exemption regime and the single family fund exemption regime, because in the single family office exemption regime, there is no such deeming provision. Or let's put it this way, the deeming provision has been modified that even though under the single family office tax exemption regime, the beneficial owner is a Hong Kong family, that there wouldn't be such deeming provision or deeming rules to tax the family. So now let me pass the floor to Jackie to carry on the discussion about the measure mentioned in the budget. Over to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Roy. This is Jackie. I will now share about the implementation timeline of Pillar 2 in Hong Kong, and also the tax incentive for specific sector that are mentioned in the budget. Before we go into the details, we have a polling question for you. The question is here. What is the implementation timeline of Pillar 2 in your jurisdiction? Is it by 2024, by 2025, or not certain yet? Over the past years, many jurisdictions have been working on Pillar 2 and also their domestic minimum tax regime. And some of them have already announced their implementation timeline. For example, Korea will be in 2024. Malaysia will also be in 2024. Singapore will be in 2025. In Europe, Germany, France, and UK will be in 2024. And for China and the US, the Pillar 2 timeline is not confirmed yet. So let's see the results. So most of you have chosen not certain yet. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, let's take a look at the overview of the Hong Kong timeline on Pillar 2 implementation. Hong Kong has all along been fully committed to implement Pillar 2. Back to last year, in February 2022, the Financial Secretary mentioned in the budget that the government planned to implement the global minimum tax regime. Since then, the government has been liaising and exchanging views with the trade and closely monitoring the implementation plan of Pillar 2 in other jurisdictions. In August last year, the Hong Kong government announced that the implementation of Pillar 2 in Hong Kong will be deferred with reference to the progress of other jurisdictions. Despite of the Pillar 2 implementation, the Hong Kong government emphasized that they will still preserve the advantage of Hong Kong tax regime in terms of its simplicity, certainty, and also transparency, and will continue to maintain the territorial source principle of taxation as well as minimize the compliance burden of MNE on Pillar 2. Following the announcement of the implementation of global minimum tax by some other jurisdictions, such as Korea, Malaysia, UK, France, Singapore, as we have just mentioned, and more administrative guidance released by the OECD in February this year, the Financial Secretary confirmed in this year's budget that Hong Kong will also implement the Pillar 2 global minimum tax and also introduce a domestic minimum top-up tax from 2025 onwards. So we will wait and see the further guidelines to be published. It is estimated that Pillar 2 will generate tax revenue of around 15 Hong Kong dollar billion per year for the Hong Kong government. And consultation will also be launched to allow the MME groups to make early preparation. Next slide, please. The next topic is about the tax incentive mentioned in the budget to some particular sector. The first one I would like to share is related to telecommunications sector in respect of the tax deduction on the payment of spectrum utilization fee. As a background, there was a court case disputing on whether the upfront lump sum spectrum utilization fee paid by a telecommunication taxpayer to the telecommunication authority is deductible or not for tax purpose. In November 2022, the Court of Appeal released its decision that such payment is capital in nature and therefore not deductible for Hong Kong tax purpose. This judgment obviously has negative impact on the telecommunication sector. In particular, we all know that this upfront payment is required to be made for entering into the telecommunication business. but they are now regarded as capital in nature and non-deductible under the court case. We believe that it would reduce the attractiveness of setting up the business in Hong Kong because such payment is a significant cost of telecommunication business but could not be deductible for tax purpose. So, in order to improve Hong Kong competitiveness in the telecommunications sector and to encourage more network operators to invest in Hong Kong infrastructure for providing a better communication service to companies and the Hong Kong public, the government in this year's budget proposed to provide a tax deduction for the spectrum utilization fee paid for the radio spectrum. However, please note that this does not mean it would overturn the decision of the court case, but instead, the proposed tax deduction will only be applicable for future bidders who will incur such fee. With this incentive, we believe that it could provide certainty to the industry player on the tax implication for the spectrum utilization fee. So on the same page, you can see that there is another new tax incentive related to patent box. So innovation and technology are always the focus area in the government budget. In prior years, the government introduced, for example, super tax deduction on the qualifying R&D expenditure, and also provide different subsidy and assistance to taxpayers who conduct R&D activities in Hong Kong. This year, the government proposed to introduce a patent box tax incentive, which target to provide tax concession for profits sourced in Hong Kong from qualifying patent. Here, the qualifying patent refer to those generated through R&D activities performed in Hong Kong. The consultation on the patent box tax arrangement will begin this year, with a target to submit the proposed amendment to the Hong Kong Legislative Council in the first half of 2024. As such, the tax legislation of patent box is likely to be effective from 2025 or after. So that would be similar to the Pillar 2 timeline. We therefore expect that the government would also take into consideration the impact of Pillar 2 on this new tax incentive. Next slide, please. The next incentive is related to aircraft leasing. As you may know, the aircraft leasing preferential tax regime was first introduced in Hong Kong in year 2017. Under the existing regime, qualifying aircraft lessor or qualifying aircraft leasing manager can enjoy a half profit tax rate, that is 8.25% on the profit derived from qualifying aircraft leasing activities. However, the coverage of the current regime is relatively limited. For example, the regime only provides preferential tax treatment to dry lease arrangement for a term exceeding 1 year. In current year budget, the government reiterated that it has been striving to establish Hong Kong as an aircraft leasing and service hub. The government has conducted a trade consultation, and the consultation paper was published in November 2022 in order to enhance the current aircraft leasing tax regime. There are quite a number of suggested amendments under the proposal. So now let us take a look at a few of the examples. First, the government proposed to expand the scope and coverage of lease and also aircraft leasing activities. For example, it proposed to extend the coverage of the lease to funding lease and also wet lease, and no longer limits the benefit to only leasing the aircraft to an aircraft operator, but also would extend the benefit for leasing to non-aircraft operator. Second, under the existing regime, the acquisition cost of aircraft is not allowed for any depreciation allowance if the aircraft is leased to a non-Hong Kong aircraft operator. Instead, the existing regime offers a tax-based concession where 20% of the let lease payment derived by the lessor would be assessed for tax purpose. However, under Pillar 2, this tax-based concession would be a permanent difference for deferred tax purpose. Therefore, no deferred tax liability would be created, and it will reduce the effective tax rate of the taxpayer for Pillar 2. It follows that the aircraft lessor, if it is under a MNE group subject to Pillar 2, it would be liable to a greater amount of top-up tax under Pillar 2. It would therefore put Hong Kong in a relatively disadvantaged position for setting up aircraft leasing business. Therefore, it is now proposed to replace the 20% tax-based concession by allowing a tax deduction of the aircraft acquisition cost. As compared with a tax-based concession, this could mitigate the permanent difference issue, as the proposed tax depreciation allowance of the acquisition cost will be a temporary difference, which will therefore give rise to deferred tax liability, and this deferred tax liability will be part of the cover tax for Pillar 2 purpose. The third one is about the interest on loan borrowed to finance the aircraft acquisition. The existing tax deduction under the regime is very limited, and the interest expense would be disallowed if the lender is an overseas non-financial institution or an overseas associate of the borrower. In order to allow more flexibility for the aircraft lessor on financing, it is now proposed to relax the condition on tax deduction to accommodate the different financing means for the acquisition of aircraft. For example, for interest made on loan borrowed from an overseas associate, it will still be deductible subject to the satisfaction of certain conditions. For the last item in the table, in determining whether a preferential tax regime could meet OECD standard on harmful tax practice, OECD will take into account on whether the regime can meet the substantial activities requirement. As currently there is no specified threshold requirement for aircraft lessor and aircraft leasing manager in the law, the government proposed to specify the threshold as we have stated in the table, which would be one full-time employee plus Hong Kong dollar 2 million operating expenditure for aircraft lessor, and 2 full-time employees plus Hong Kong dollar 10 million operating expenditure for aircraft leasing manager. We welcome for this proposed measure and expect that the implementation of this amendment could attract more international aircraft lessor and leasing manager to set up their business in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. Finally, the following incentive will apply to all business sectors. In the budget, the Hong Kong government expects that there will be a decrease of Hong Kong workforce because of the problem of the aging population and a declining birth rate in Hong Kong. Currently, there are around 1.5 million elderly people aged 65 or above in Hong Kong, which is about 20% of the total population. Many of them are actually still capable of working beyond their traditional retirement age, and they are also willing to stay in employment. In order to encourage the employers to continue hire these employees, the government proposed in the budget to increase the tax deduction for the MPF, Mandatory Provident Fund voluntary contribution, made by the employers to these employees who are aged 65 or above, from the current 100% to 200% in respect of such expenditure. We believe this measure could encourage employers to hire more elderly people. It could also maintain the workforce in Hong Kong labor market, and at the same time helps the elderly to increase their retirement saving. So these all are our sharing today. We will now move to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Roy. This brings us to the end of today's discussion. We now have some time to respond to some questions from our audience. The first one, let me repeat the questions to the audience. It is about the single-family office. I think this is Roy's turn. The question is about for single-family office. Is there any reason provided for having a 95% threshold? Why not have it at 100% instead?
Right. Yeah. So let me take this question. I think we are referring to the ownership requirement for both the FIHV, which is the investment holding vehicle, as well as the single family office entity. So basically, the regime says both entities are required to be at least 95% owned by one or more members of one single family, right? So actually, it is a good question because initially when the government launched the consultation almost roughly 1 year ago, in the conceptual paper that they issued, the requirement at that time was actually 100% ownership. Okay, but during the industry consultation, there are quite a number of feedbacks and comments on the regime. One being that it is pretty common actually for like family or high net worth individuals to set up charitable trusts. Okay, so so that in terms of like the ownership structures of the family assets or family investments, you know, some of them would be actually owned by the charitable trusts established by the family, right? So we have actually provided this feedback to the government, and also the industry shared the similar feedback. And after that, the government took into account the feedback and the comments, and therefore they reduced the threshold now to 95%, which allow certain flexibility in terms of like having a charitable trust at the top to also co-own the family asset together with the family. So that's the background. I mean and also the reason why we now see a reduced threshold.
Okay, thank you, Roy. I also got another question regarding the top talent pass scheme. The question is why it is so attractive, and can we share a little more details? Actually, the key features of, let me answer this part. The key features of this top talent pass scheme is that the overseas applicant does not require to secure an employment offer in Hong Kong upon application. Just a brief details. To apply for this top talent pass scheme, there are three ways to do so. There are three categories in this scheme. First of all, the applicant should have an annual income of 2.5 million Hong Kong dollar or above in a year before the application. Secondly, he or she should have been graduated from the world's top university and with at least 3 years work experience. And for the third type, the category C, the applicant should also be graduated from the top university, but it is no need that the applicant should have the 3-year work experience, which means that if he or she is a fresh graduate in the past few years, even without any work experience, he or she can try to apply to enter Hong Kong under this top talent pass scheme. So either with 2.5 million annual income, with certain work experience, or even without work experience, if you are graduated in the top universities. Actually, we did help quite many of our clients to apply for this top talent pass scheme since the launch in the end of 22. You may ask why people need to reach out to the professional firm to apply for such scheme. The reason is because how to determine the annual income of 2.5 million Hong Kong dollar, because if it is purely salary, it seems straightforward, but it could be some case that the applicant may have other kinds of income. So in this case, we can help to review the situation of the applicant and see whether they can which kind of category most suit their situation. And it seems we still have some time. We can take one more question. And also for Roy, you mentioned about the incidental transactions in the family office regime. Can you tell us more about what is the incidental transaction?
Right. Yeah, thank you, Polly. I think the term incidental transaction or incidental income may be familiar to you guys, because this term or this potential issue already exists in our unified fund exemption regime. Okay, so basically both the fund exemption regime and the upcoming family office tax concession regime would be applicable to transaction in those specified assets, right? But there could be certain incidental income arise from holding of these specified assets, and the typical example would be interest income. Okay, so if family office, I mean single family office through the FIHV invest in bonds, say for instance, then the interest income derived from those bond investment is actually regarded as a incidental income. Okay, so the exemption basically say, okay, for a year of assessment, if the total incidental income, let's say, which is the interest income, right, in the scenario that I just mentioned, okay, so if this total interest income exceeds 5% of the gross trading proceeds derived by the FIHV, right, throughout the same year, then that if that 5% threshold is exceeded, then the entire incidental income, which is interest income, is not eligible for tax exemption, right? So therefore, those interest income we will need to look at whether we can argue those interest income as offshore interest income. But bear in mind, for offshore income, as Polly mentioned earlier, it will be subject to the new foreign source income exemption regime, FSID regime in Hong Kong, right? So that could potentially be an issue for family office, for single family office, with a significant investment portfolio in debt securities such as bonds, right? So we did provide comment or feedback to the governments in this regard, hoping that they can relax on this 5% threshold restriction, and yeah, so we'll wait to see whether what the final bill comes out will look like, and besides in the budget, the financial secretary also mentioned that they will review the existing fund exemption regime together with the carried interest tax exemption regime. So we hope this 5% incidental income issue could also be addressed throughout that review.
Okay, thank you, Roy. Thank you, Roy and Jackie again, and special thanks to all of you who were able to join us today. We would like to encourage you to fill out the short survey that will pop up in your screen shortly, and tell us what do you think about today's program. If you join us late, please note that this presentation will be archived for future viewing. If you feel that others would benefit from this webcast, please share the webcast via the share this icon and have them visit our debrief website. We will respond to the questions you submitted during the webcast in a couple of weeks. Also, if you think of other questions or comments later, please feel free to reach out to either of us. We'll be more than happy to talk to you. And please don't forget to tune in to our next scheduled webcast from the Global Mobility and Talent Rewards on 23rd March, titled Deloitte's Global Remote Work Survey. At last, from all of us at Deloitte, thank you for your participation in Deloitte's Asia Pacific Tax webcast today. Goodbye.